The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after noon, and Carter Jenkins knew from the way it moved that whoever was driving was fighting a losing battle with their wagon. He set down the fence post he had been wrestling into the hard Texas soil and wiped the sweat from his brow, squinting against the harsh August sun of 1876. The cloud grew closer, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of wood scraping against rock, and a wheel threatening to give up completely. When the wagon finally lurched into view at the edge of his property, it was listing badly to one side, pulled by a single exhausted mare that looked ready to collapse. Carter started walking toward the road, his long strides eating up the distance. The wagon came to a shuddering halt about 50 yards from his ranch house, and he could see the driver now, a woman in a faded blue dress, struggling to keep the mare calm as the animal tossed her head and whinnied in distress. The wagon groaned ominously, and then with a crack that echoed across the open land, the rear axle finally gave way, dropping the back corner into the dirt with a thud that sent up another cloud of dust. The woman climbed down carefully, and Carter got his first good look at her as she stood there in the road, one hand on the mare's neck, the other shading her eyes as she surveyed the damage. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a bun that had mostly come loose during her journey. Her dress was covered in road dust, and there was a determined set to her jaw that suggested she was not the type to cry over bad luck, even when it seemed to be piling up on her. "Madam," Carter called out as he approached, keeping his voice calm so as not to spook the horse further. "Looks like you have had some trouble." She turned to face him, and he was struck by the directness of her gaze. Her eyes were a clear gray-green, the color of sage after rain, and they studied him with a mixture of wariness and hope that told him she had been traveling alone for some time. "That would be putting it mildly," she said, and despite the exhaustion in her voice, there was a hint of dry humor there. "The axle has been threatening to break since I left San Antonio 3 days ago. I was hoping to make it to my cousin's place in Sierra City before it gave out completely, but it seems my luck has run out about 20 miles too soon." Carter walked around the wagon, assessing the damage. The axle was split clean through, and one of the wheels had a cracked rim that he had missed on his first glance. The wagon bed itself seemed sound enough, but it was loaded with what looked like all the woman's worldly possessions, trunks and crates and bundles wrapped in canvas. This was not someone taking a casual trip. This was someone relocating her entire life. "I can fix it," he said, straightening up and meeting her eyes. "But it will take a few days to do it right. The axle needs to be replaced, and that wheel rim should be reinforced before you take it any farther. You will need to stay while I work on it." He saw her hesitate, saw the calculation in her eyes as she weighed her options. A woman alone, stranded on the road, being invited to stay at a stranger's ranch. In 1876, Texas, that was a decision that required careful consideration. But Carter also saw the moment when she looked at the broken wagon, at her exhausted horse, and at the empty road stretching in both directions, and realized she did not have much choice. "I can pay you for the work," she said, "and for any food or lodging, I have some money set aside." "We can discuss payment later," Carter replied. "Right now, let us get your horse unhitched and into some shade. She looks about done in, and this heat is not going to get any better before evening." The woman nodded, and together they worked to free the mare from her harness. As they worked, Carter learned that the woman's name was Grace Crawford, that she was 23 years old, and that she was indeed heading to Sierra City to live with her cousin after the death of her father in San Antonio. She did not volunteer much more than that, and Carter did not press. He had learned long ago that people on the frontier often carried stories they were not ready to share, and it was better to let them unfold in their own time. He led the mare to his small barn, Grace following behind with a nervous energy that suggested she was unused to accepting help from strangers. The barn was neat and well maintained, with 3 other horses in stalls and a milk cow in the corner. Carter got the mare settled with fresh water and hay, and the animal immediately began drinking with the desperate thirst of someone who had been pushed too hard for too long. "She should rest for a few days before you take her any farther," Carter said, running a hand along the mare's flank. "She is dehydrated and her hooves need attention. When did you last have her shod?" "About 6 months ago," Grace admitted. "My father was ill and there were other priorities. I know I should have taken better care, but there was not much time or money for anything beyond the essentials." Carter heard the guilt in her voice and the exhaustion that went deeper than just a few hard days on the road. This was someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for a long time, and the weight of it showed in the slump of her shoulders and the shadows under her eyes. "Come up to the house," he said. "You need water and food, and we can discuss what needs to be done with the wagon." Grace followed him across the dusty yard to the ranch house, a sturdy structure of wood and stone that Carter had built mostly with his own hands over the past 5 years. It was not fancy, but it was solid and comfortable, with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze and windows that let in the morning light. Inside, it was neat in the way that bachelor homes sometimes were, everything in its place because there was little enough that each item had an obvious spot. Carter poured water from a pitcher into 2 tin cups and handed one to Grace, who drank it down almost as quickly as her mare had. He refilled it without comment and gestured for her to sit at the rough-hewn table that dominated the main room. "I have some cold chicken left from last night," he said, pulling a covered plate from the cool box he kept in the corner. "And there is bread from yesterday. It is not much, but it will do until I can make something more substantial for supper." Grace accepted the food with quiet thanks, and Carter watched as she ate with the careful control of someone who was absolutely starving but determined not to show it. He had seen that before, in people who had known real hunger and had learned to hide their need behind a veneer of manners. While she ate, Carter began making a list of what he would need to repair the wagon. The axle would have to be replaced entirely, which meant either finding a suitable piece of seasoned wood in his lumber stores or making a trip into Sierra City to buy one. The wheel rim could be reinforced with metal strapping, which he had in his workshop. The harness had looked worn in places and would benefit from some leather work. All told, it was 3 or 4 days of work, maybe more if he discovered additional problems once he got the wagon back to his workshop. "I have a guest room," he said when Grace had finished eating. "It is small, but it has a proper bed and a window that catches the breeze. You are welcome to it for as long as the repairs take." Grace looked up from her empty plate, and for the first time since she had arrived, some of the tension went out of her shoulders. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Jenkins. I confess I was not sure what I was going to do when the wagon broke down. The thought of being stranded out here alone was not a pleasant one." "Call me Carter," he said. "And you are not stranded. You are just delayed. There is a difference." Something that might have been a smile flickered across Grace's face, there and gone too quickly to be sure. "Then please call me Grace. And thank you, Carter, truly." The rest of that first day passed in a blur of practical activity. Carter helped Grace unload the most essential items from her wagon and carry them into the house. He showed her the guest room, which was indeed small but clean and comfortable, with a bed covered in a quilt that his mother had made before she died. He gave her a basin of water so she could wash off the road dust, and he pointedly stayed outside on the porch while she cleaned up and changed into a fresh dress. When she emerged, looking considerably more human and less like a dust-covered ghost, Carter was working on repairing a bridle that had been waiting for his attention for weeks. She sat down in the other chair on the porch, and for a while they just sat in companionable silence as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "How long have you had this ranch?" Grace asked eventually, her voice quiet in the evening stillness. 5 years, Carter replied, not looking up from his work. "I bought the land with money I saved from working cattle drives up to Kansas. It is not much, just 160 acres, but it is mine. I run a small herd, do some horse breeding, grow enough crops to feed myself and the animals. It is a good life." "Do you run it alone?" Grace asked, and Carter heard the real question beneath the words. Was there a wife, a family? Other people she would need to navigate around during her stay? "Alone," he confirmed. "I had a hired hand for a while, but he moved on to California last year. I have been meaning to find someone else, but I have not gotten around to it. Most days, I manage well enough on my own." Grace nodded, and Carter could almost feel her relax further. He understood. A woman alone on a ranch with a single man was already pushing the boundaries of propriety, but at least there would be no one else to witness her presence here and make assumptions or spread gossip. "What about you?" Carter asked, setting aside the bridle and finally looking at her directly. "You said you were going to stay with your cousin in Sierra City. Is that a permanent arrangement?" Grace was silent for a long moment, staring out at the darkening landscape. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "My father died 2 months ago. He was a clerk in San Antonio, and when he passed, I discovered that he had debts I knew nothing about. I sold everything I could to pay them, but it was not enough to keep the house. My cousin Sarah wrote and offered me a place to stay until I can figure out what comes next. She runs a boarding house in Sierra City, and she said she could use help with the cooking and cleaning." "I am sorry about your father," Carter said, and meant it. He knew what it was like to lose family, to suddenly find yourself unmoored in the world. "Thank you," Grace said quietly. "He was a good man, but he was never very practical about money. He liked to help people, even when we could not afford it. I suppose that is not the worst way to be remembered." Darkness fell properly then, and Carter lit a lantern to keep the shadows at bay. He made a simple supper of beans and cornbread, and they ate together at the table while moths beat against the windows, drawn to the light. The conversation stayed light and careful, two strangers feeling their way towards something that might become friendship, given time. That night, lying in the narrow bed in the guest room, Grace listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling around her. She heard the horses moving in the barn, the distant yip of a coyote, the wind rattling the shutters. She thought about the past few months, about watching her father grow weaker and knowing there was nothing she could do to stop it. She thought about the creditors who had shown up at the door with their bills and their cold eyes, about the feeling of watching strangers carry away her mother's china and her father's books. She thought about the wagon breaking down, and the moment of pure panic when she realized she was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no good options. And she thought about the tall, lean cowboy with sun-weathered skin and dark brown hair who had looked at her broken wagon and said with absolute certainty that he could fix it, that she should stay. There had been no judgment in his voice, no suggestion that she was a burden or an inconvenience. Just simple statement of fact and an offer of help. Grace did not trust easily anymore. The past few months had taught her that people who seemed kind often wanted something in return, that help came with strings attached. But there had been something in Carter's steady brown eyes, something in the quiet competence of his movements that made her want to believe he was different. She would stay, because she had no choice. But she would also watch and listen and keep her guard up, because that was what survival required. And if Carter Jenkins turned out to be as decent as he seemed, well, that would be a pleasant surprise in a year that had offered precious few of them. The next morning, Grace woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was, and then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 remaining everyday dresses and went out to find Carter at the stove, managing breakfast with the easy competence of someone who had been cooking for himself for a long time. "Good morning," he said when he saw her. "I hope you slept well. There is coffee in the pot and breakfast will be ready in a few minutes." Grace poured herself coffee and took a cautious sip. It was strong and hot and exactly what she needed. "I slept very well, thank you. Better than I have in weeks, actually. I think I was more exhausted than I realized." "Grief is exhausting," Carter said simply, flipping the bacon with practiced ease. "And so is being alone with too many responsibilities. You needed the rest." They ate breakfast together, and then Carter outlined his plan for the day. He would start by examining the wagon more thoroughly to make a complete list of needed repairs. He had a spare axle that might work if it was the right size, but he would need to take measurements. Grace could help if she wanted, or she could rest and recover from her journey. Her choice. Grace, who had spent the last 2 months in constant motion, always working, always trying to stay ahead of the next crisis, found herself oddly drawn to the idea of helping. It would be better than sitting idle, better than being alone with her thoughts. "I will help," she said. "I do not know much about wagons, but I can hand you tools and help with measurements." Carter nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected. Together, they walked out to where the wagon still sat in the road, looking forlorn with its broken rear end tilted into the dust. Carter circled it slowly, running his hands along the wood, checking joints and connections with a critical eye. "The construction is solid," he said after a while. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing. It is just age and hard use catching up with it. The axle is the main problem, but I am also seeing some loose boards in the bed that should be reinforced, and the tongue has a crack that needs attention before it becomes a break." He disappeared into his workshop and returned with an armload of tools and a measuring stick. For the next several hours, they worked together in the morning heat, Carter taking measurements and making notes while Grace held boards steady and handed him tools when he needed them. It was simple work, but there was something soothing about it, something that felt almost meditative. As they worked, they talked in fits and starts, the conversation flowing and ebbing naturally. Carter told her about growing up in Missouri, about coming to Texas after the war ended when he was barely 18, about the years he had spent working other people's cattle before saving enough to buy his own land. Grace found herself telling him about her childhood in San Antonio, about her mother who had died when Grace was 15, about the way her father had retreated into his work after that, becoming more absent even as Grace struggled to keep their household running. "It sounds like you have been taking care of yourself for a long time," Carter observed at one point, not looking up from the measurements he was recording. "I suppose I have," Grace admitted. "My father meant well, but he was not very present after my mother died. I learned to cook and clean and manage the household accounts. I learned to deal with tradesmen and shopkeepers. I learned to be practical, even when I did not want to be." "That is not a bad thing to learn," Carter said. "Practical keeps you alive out here." By midday, the heat had become oppressive, and Carter called a halt to their work. They retreated to the house, and Grace insisted on making lunch while Carter went to check on the animals. She found the kitchen surprisingly well stocked, with flour and beans and dried meat, and she put together a simple meal of sandwiches and pickles from a jar she found in the cool box. When Carter came back, there was something in his expression that caught Grace's attention. "What is wrong?" she asked. "Nothing is wrong exactly," he said slowly. "But I think your mare is lame. I noticed she was favoring her front right leg when I checked on her just now. It might just be bruising from the hard journey, but it could be something more serious. I want to take a closer look after lunch." Grace felt a weight settle in her stomach. If the mare was seriously lame, that was another problem, another expense, another delay. She had been hoping to be on her way to Sierra City within a few days, but if the horse could not travel, she would be stuck here even longer. Carter must have seen something of her thoughts in her face because he said gently, "Do not borrow trouble. Let me examine her properly, and then we will know what we are dealing with. Most likely it is just bruising, and rest will fix it. But even if it is something more, we will figure it out." That casual "we" did something strange to Grace's chest, made it feel tight and warm at the same time. She was so used to facing problems alone, to being the only one responsible for finding solutions. The idea that someone else might share that burden, even temporarily, was almost disorienting. After lunch, they went together to the barn. The mare was standing with her weight off the front right leg, a sure sign of pain. Carter approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice, and the horse allowed him to run his hands down her leg, checking for heat or swelling. "There is definitely some swelling in the fetlock," he said after a thorough examination. "And she is tender when I apply pressure here. It could be a strain, or she might have bruised it on a rock during the journey. Either way, she needs rest and cold compresses to bring down the swelling." "How long?" Grace asked, keeping her voice steady even though inside she felt a growing sense of panic. Every day she was delayed was another day imposing on Carter's hospitality, another day of uncertainty. "At least a week, maybe 2 before I would want to see her pulling a wagon," Carter said honestly. "I am sorry, Grace. I know that is not what you wanted to hear." Grace closed her eyes and took a deep breath, forcing down the urge to scream or cry or both. She had been through worse than this. She had watched her father die by inches. She had sold her childhood home to strangers. She could handle a delayed journey. "Then I will stay for a week or 2, she said, opening her eyes and meeting Carter's concerned gaze. "And I will work to earn my keep. You said you needed a hired hand." "Well, I am here and I can work. Show me what needs doing and I will do it." Carter studied her for a long moment, and Grace had the sense that he was seeing past her words to the determination and desperation beneath them. "All right," he said finally, "but we do this properly. I will pay you fair wages for fair work, same as I would pay any hired hand. And you stay in the guest room without any expectation beyond that." "Agreed, agreed," Grace said, and they shook on it, her small hand disappearing into his calloused one. Over the next few days, Grace threw herself into ranch work with an intensity that surprised both of them. She learned to collect eggs from the chickens without getting pecked, to milk the cow without spilling half of it, to feed the horses and muck out stalls. Carter showed her how to repair fence lines and identify which plants in the garden needed water. She helped him finish cataloging the wagon repairs, and in the evenings after supper, she would sit on the porch while he worked in his workshop on the new axle, the sound of his saw and plane creating a rhythmic backdrop to the darkening sky. They fell into an easy routine, rising with the sun, working through the morning, taking a break during the worst heat of midday, and then working again until evening. Grace cooked meals that were more elaborate than the simple fare Carter was used to, and he praised her cooking with genuine appreciation that made her feel absurdly pleased. In return, he taught her practical skills that she had never needed in San Antonio, but that were essential for frontier life. One evening, about 5 days after Grace's arrival, they were sitting on the porch after supper when a rider appeared on the road. Carter stood up, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle that he kept by the door, but he relaxed when he recognized the newcomer. "That is Tom Davis," he told Grace. "He runs the ranch about 10 miles east of here. He is a good man." The rider, a weather-beaten man in his 50s with gray streaking his beard, pulled up in front of the house and dismounted with a creak of leather and joints. "Carter," he said by way of greeting, and then his eyes moved to Grace, curious but not unfriendly. "Tom, this is Grace Crawford," Carter said. "Her wagon broke down on the road and she is staying here while I make repairs. Grace, Tom Davis is my nearest neighbor." Grace stood and nodded politely, aware of the calculation happening behind Tom's eyes. This was the moment where gossip could start, where assumptions could be made that would damage her reputation beyond repair. But Tom just touched the brim of his hat and said, "Madam, sorry to hear about your wagon troubles. Carter does good work, though. He will have you back on the road in no time." "I am sure he will," Grace said, relieved by Tom's matter-of-fact tone. Tom had come to borrow some tool that Carter had, and while the two men conducted their business, Grace excused herself and went inside to clean up the supper dishes. She could hear their voices through the open window, low and companionable, and she wondered what Tom was saying, whether he was asking questions about her presence. When Tom left half an hour later, Carter came back inside to find Grace finishing the dishes. "He seems nice," she said carefully. "He is," Carter confirmed. "He is also the biggest gossip in 3 counties, which means that by tomorrow, everyone within 50 miles will know that you are staying here. I am sorry about that, but there is not much we can do about it." Grace felt her stomach drop. "Will that cause problems for you?" Carter shrugged. "Probably not. Everyone knows I am honest, and anyone who knows me will believe that this is exactly what it looks like, a simple case of helping someone in need. But I wanted you to know that people will talk." "People always talk," Grace said with a bitterness that surprised her. "And they always assume the worst. I appreciate your honesty, though." That night, lying in bed, Grace thought about reputation and scandal and all the ways that a woman's life could be destroyed by gossip and innuendo. She thought about the fact that she was staying alone with an unmarried man, and how in polite society that would be considered completely unacceptable. But this was not polite society. This was the Texas frontier in 1876, where sometimes survival mattered more than propriety, where practical necessity often overrode social niceties. And if she was honest with herself, she did not care much what people thought anymore. She had lost too much, been through too much, to waste energy worrying about whether strangers approved of her choices. She was here because her wagon had broken down and Carter had offered help. That was all there was to it. Or at least, that was what she told herself as she drifted off to sleep, trying to ignore the small voice in the back of her mind that whispered she was staying for reasons that had less to do with a broken wagon and an injured horse, and more to do with the way Carter looked at her like she was capable and strong rather than fragile and in need of protection. The days continued to pass, each one blending into the next in a pattern of work and meals and quiet conversations that gradually revealed the shape of 2 lives that were slowly intertwining. Carter worked on the wagon repairs with methodical care, replacing the axle and reinforcing the wheel rim and fixing a dozen small problems that Grace had not even known existed. Grace tended to the mare, applying cold compresses and gentle exercise, until the swelling went down and the horse began putting weight on the leg again. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and talk about everything and nothing. Carter told her about the challenges of running a ranch alone, about droughts and cattle rustlers and harsh winters that killed half his herd. Grace told him about life in San Antonio, about the tension between American settlers and the Tejano population, about the economic struggles that had plagued the city after the war. They argued good-naturedly about politics and religion, and whether coffee should be strong enough to stand a spoon in. They discovered shared opinions about literature, a mutual love of Shakespeare and Dickens, though they disagreed vehemently about whether Hamlet was a tragic hero or simply indecisive. It was during one of these evening conversations, about 10 days after Grace's arrival, that Carter asked the question that had clearly been on his mind for a while. What will you do in Sierra City? I mean, beyond helping your cousin with the boarding house. Do you have plans for after that? Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. I honestly do not know, she admitted. I have been so focused on just getting there, on having a roof over my head and enough to eat, that I have not thought much beyond that. I suppose I will work for my cousin for a while, save money if I can. Maybe eventually find a position as a teacher or a governess. I had 2 years of normal school before my mother died, so I am qualified, even if I never finished. You would make a good teacher, Carter said thoughtfully. You are patient and you explain things clearly. I have noticed that when you have been teaching me your recipes. Grace laughed softly. I think you are giving me too much credit, but thank you. What about you? Do you have plans beyond this ranch? Carter leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful in the gathering darkness. I would like to expand the horse breeding operation. There is good money in it if you develop a reputation for quality stock, and maybe eventually hire a few hands so I am not doing everything myself. But mostly, I want to keep building this place into something solid, something that will last. It sounds like you have thought about it a lot, Grace observed. I have, Carter admitted. When you grow up with nothing, when you spend years working for other people and sleeping in bunkhouses and having no place that is really yours, the idea of building something permanent becomes important. This ranch is not much compared to the big spreads in this part of Texas, but it is mine. Every fence post I set, every board I nail, every calf that is born here is proof that I exist, that I matter. There was such naked honesty in his words that Grace felt something shift in her chest, some wall she had been keeping carefully maintained beginning to crack. She understood that need for permanence, that desire to build something that could not be taken away. She had felt the lack of it keenly over the past few months as everything familiar had been stripped away from her. I think what you have built here is remarkable, she said quietly. And I think you should be proud of it. Carter turned to look at her, and in the dim light from the lantern, his eyes were very dark and very serious. Thank you, Grace. That means more than you might think. The moment stretched between them, weighted with things neither of them was quite ready to say, and then Carter cleared his throat and stood up. I should check on the horses one more time before bed. Do you want to come with me? Grace stood and followed him out to the barn, and they moved through the familiar routine of checking water buckets and securing stall doors. The mare nickered softly when Grace approached, and Grace ran a hand down the horse's neck, pleased to feel that the swelling in her leg had almost completely gone down. She is healing well, Carter said, coming to stand beside Grace. Another few days and I think she will be sound enough to travel, and the wagon is nearly finished. I just need to apply a final coat of sealant to the axle and make sure everything is secure. Grace nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. She should be happy that the repairs were almost complete, that she would soon be able to continue her journey to Sierra City. But instead, she felt a strange reluctance, a desire to stretch out these last few days, to hold onto this unexpected pocket of peace she had found on Carter's ranch. "You have done beautiful work," she said, because it was true, and because she did not know how else to express the complicated tangle of gratitude and regret she was feeling. They walked back to the house in companionable silence, and Grace bid Carter good night before retreating to the guest room. But sleep was elusive, and she lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and trying to sort through her feelings. The truth was that she had come to care for Carter Jenkins in a way that went far beyond gratitude for his help. She liked the quiet competence with which he approached every task. She liked the way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her opinions mattered. She liked his dry sense of humor and his kindness to animals, and the way his hands moved when he was working, sure and skilled. She liked the feeling of safety she had here, the sense that she could let down her guard and just breathe. But Grace was also practical enough to know that liking someone and building a life with them were two very different things. She barely knew Carter, had been here less than 2 weeks. And she had obligations, a cousin waiting for her in Sierra City, a plan that she needed to follow through on. She could not just abandon her responsibilities because she had developed feelings for a cowboy who had been kind to her. Could she? The question haunted her as she finally drifted off to sleep. And it was still there when she woke the next morning to another day of work and careful conversation, and the growing awareness that her time at the ranch was running out. 2 days later, Carter declared the wagon fully repaired and the mare sound enough to travel. He hitched up the horse himself, checking and rechecking every buckle and strap, and then he loaded Grace's belongings back into the wagon bed with the same methodical care he had shown in all the repairs. Grace watched this process with a growing sense of panic that she tried desperately to hide. This was what she had wanted, what she had been waiting for. She should be relieved, excited even. Sierra City was only a day's journey from here, and her cousin was waiting. She would have a place to stay, work to do, a chance to rebuild her life. So why did it feel like she was about to make a terrible mistake? "Everything is secure," Carter said, stepping back from the wagon and wiping his hands on his pants. "You should not have any problems, but take it slow, especially over rough ground. And if you have any trouble at all, turn back. You know you are always welcome here." "Thank you," Grace said, and hated how small her voice sounded. "For everything, Carter. I do not know what I would have done if you had not helped me." "You would have figured something out," Carter said with a small smile. "You are resourceful, Grace. You are going to be fine." Grace wanted to argue, wanted to say that she did not want to be fine on her own, that she wanted to stay here where she felt safe and valued and maybe even loved, though that was too much to hope for. But the words stuck in her throat, held back by pride and fear, and the weight of all the expectations she carried. So instead, she climbed up onto the wagon seat and took the reins in her hands. Carter stepped back, and Grace made herself release the brake and click to the mare, who moved forward obediently. The wagon rolled smoothly, a testament to Carter's skill, and Grace kept her eyes forward, afraid that if she looked back, she would lose her nerve completely. She made it about half a mile down the road before she had to stop. Her hands were shaking on the reins, and there was a tightness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. She sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty road ahead, and then she thought about what waited for her in Sierra City. A cousin she had not seen in 5 years, a boarding house full of strangers, work that would keep her busy but not fulfilled. A life of going through the motions, of surviving but not really living. And then she thought about Carter's ranch. The quiet mornings and the honest work and the easy companionship. The way Carter looked at her like she was someone worth knowing, worth listening to. The feeling of coming home that she had felt every time she walked back into that simple ranch house after a day of work. Grace made a decision. She turned the wagon around. Carter was in his workshop when he heard the wagon coming back up the road. At first he thought he must be imagining it, that his disappointment at watching Grace leave had conjured the sound from thin air. But when he came out of the workshop, there was Grace's wagon, rolling back into the yard, and there was Grace herself, pulling the mare to a stop and setting the brake. "Grace," he said, confusion and hope warring in his voice. "Did something break? Is the mare lame again?" Grace climbed down from the wagon seat, and when she turned to face him, there were tears on her cheeks but also a determination in her eyes that Carter had not seen before. "No," she said. "Everything is fine. The wagon is perfect and the mare is sound. But I cannot do it, Carter. I cannot just leave like this." "I do not understand," Carter said, even though his heart was starting to beat faster, even though he thought he might understand exactly what she meant but was afraid to hope. "I care about you," Grace said, the words coming out in a rush. "I know we have only known each other for 2 weeks, and I know this is probably crazy, but I care about you, Carter. And the thought of going to Sierra City and never seeing you again, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I had been brave enough to stay, I cannot do it. I just cannot." Carter stood very still, afraid that if he moved, the moment would shatter and he would wake up to find this was just a dream. "Grace," he said carefully, "are you saying what I think you are saying?" "I am saying that I want to stay," Grace replied, her voice stronger now. "If you will have me. I know I am probably not what you were looking for, and I know this is sudden, but these past 2 weeks have been the happiest I have been in years. I feel like myself here, like I can breathe, and I do not want to give that up. I do not want to give you up." Carter closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, and then his hands were cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. "You are exactly what I was looking for," he said fiercely. "I just did not know it until you showed up with your broken wagon and your determination to handle everything on your own. And I have been trying for the past 2 days to figure out how to ask you to stay without sounding like I was taking advantage of your situation." "You could never take advantage of me," Grace said, her hands coming up to cover his. "You are too honorable for that." "Then stay," Carter said. "Stay and build a life here with me. It will not be easy, and I cannot promise you anything fancy, but I can promise you honesty and hard work and a partnership built on mutual respect. And I can promise you that I will spend every day trying to make you happy." "Yes," Grace said, and then she was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will stay. I will stay and build a life with you, and I will be so happy doing it." Carter bent his head and kissed her then, and it was sweet and tentative and full of promise. When they finally pulled apart, both of them were smiling, and the future that had seemed so uncertain just moments before suddenly felt solid and real. "I should probably write to my cousin," Grace said breathlessly. "She is going to be very surprised." "I will take you into Sierra City tomorrow," Carter said. "You can explain in person and we can get whatever you need for the ranch. But tonight, let us just celebrate the fact that you came back." They spent the evening making plans, their voices overlapping with excitement as they talked about all the things they wanted to do. Carter wanted to expand the house, adding a proper kitchen, and maybe a second bedroom for when they had children. Grace wanted to start a vegetable garden, a real one, with tomatoes and beans and herbs. They would buy more chickens, maybe some pigs. They would get married as soon as possible, because waiting seemed pointless when they were both so certain. Over the next few weeks, They turned possibility into reality. Carter took Grace into Sierra City, where she met with her cousin Sarah and explained the situation. Sarah was surprised but understanding, especially when she met Carter and saw the way he looked at Grace. The trip also served as an opportunity to spread the word about their upcoming wedding and to buy supplies for the expanding ranch. They were married on a bright September morning in 1876, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Sierra City. Tom Davis served as Carter's witness, and Sarah stood up for Grace. The preacher kept the ceremony short and practical, in keeping with the frontier spirit, and when Carter kissed his bride, there was a smattering of applause from the handful of neighbors who had come to witness the union. The wedding breakfast was held at Sarah's boarding house, a cheerful affair with plenty of food and good-natured teasing. Grace wore a dress that Sarah had helped her make, simple blue calico that brought out the color of her eyes. Carter wore his best shirt and pants, his hair slicked back and his boots polished to a shine. They looked like what they were, two practical people starting a life together based on mutual affection and respect. When they finally returned to the ranch that evening, Carter lifted Grace over the threshold in the traditional way, and they both laughed at the awkwardness of it. But once they were inside, with the door closed behind them and the world shut out, the laughter faded into something deeper and more meaningful. "Welcome home, Mrs. Jenkins," Carter said softly, and Grace felt tears prick at her eyes again, but this time they were tears of joy. "I am home," she agreed, and knew that it was true. Their first year of marriage was not easy, but it was good. They worked together to expand the ranch, adding to the herd and improving the house. Grace proved to have a knack for managing finances, and under her careful stewardship, they were able to save money for the first time in Carter's life. Carter taught Grace to ride properly, and she took to it with an enthusiasm that delighted him. Together, they weathered a drought that summer and a harsh winter that followed, their partnership growing stronger with each challenge they faced. In the spring of 1877, Grace discovered she was pregnant. She broke the news to Carter one evening after supper, watching nervously as he processed the information. For a moment, he was completely still, and then a grin broke across his face that was so wide and genuine that Grace could not help but laugh. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." "We are," Grace confirmed. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not begin to cover it," Carter said, pulling her into his arms. "I am terrified and thrilled and so grateful that I do not even have words for it." The pregnancy was relatively easy, and Grace continued to work around the ranch until she was too ungainly to manage the more physical tasks. Carter became comically overprotective, insisting that she rest more than she wanted to and hovering anxiously whenever she so much as frowned. Grace found his concern both touching and occasionally exasperating, but she loved him all the more for it. Their son was born on a cold December morning in 1877, with Sarah attending as midwife, because the doctor from Sierra City could not make it through the snow in time. It was a long labor, and there were moments when Carter feared he might lose both Grace and the baby, but Sarah was competent and calm, and eventually, a baby's cry filled the small ranch house. "A boy," Sarah announced, placing the squalling infant in Grace's arms. "A healthy, loud boy." Carter came to kneel beside the bed, staring at his son with an expression of such wonder that Grace felt her heart might burst. "He is perfect," Carter whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you, Grace. Thank you for this." They named him Benjamin Carter Jenkins, and from the moment he arrived, he turned their world upside down in the best possible way. Ben was a colicky baby who did not sleep through the night for the first 6 months, and both Grace and Carter stumbled through those early days in a fog of exhaustion. But there was also joy in the small moments, in watching Ben discover his hands and learn to smile, in the way he would quiet when Carter sang to him in his rough, off-key voice. As Ben grew from baby to toddler, the ranch continued to thrive. Carter hired a young man named Jack to help with the heavier work, which freed up time for him to focus on the horse breeding operation. Grace managed the household and the accounts, and she also started taking and sewing work from neighbors, which brought in additional income. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. In 1880, Grace gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Caroline. Unlike her brother, Caroline was an easy baby who slept through the night almost from the start and rarely cried without good reason. Ben, now 3 years old, was fascinated by his baby sister and appointed himself her protector, a role he took very seriously. The years passed in a blur of activity and growth. The ranch expanded, the children grew, and Carter and Grace grew alongside them, their partnership deepening into the kind of love that comes from truly knowing another person and choosing them every day anyway. They had their disagreements, of course, moments of frustration and miscommunication, but they had also learned to talk through their problems, to approach conflicts as partners rather than adversaries. In 1883, Grace's cousin Sarah came to visit, bringing news that she was selling the boarding house and moving to California. "I am getting too old for this work," she explained as they sat on the porch watching Ben and Caroline play in the yard. "And I have a sister in San Francisco who has been asking me to come live with her. It seems like the right time." "We will miss you," Grace said, and meant it. Sarah had become a dear friend over the years, someone who understood Grace's past and celebrated her present. "And I will miss you," Sarah replied. "But I am so happy to see how well things have turned out for you, Grace. When you first wrote to tell me you were not coming to Sierra City, that you were marrying some cowboy you had just met, I confess I was worried. But Carter is a good man, and you two have built something real here. I am proud of you." After Sarah left, Grace found herself thinking about the road not taken, about what her life might have been like if she had continued on to Sierra City that day instead of turning the wagon around. She would have worked in the boarding house, would have lived a perfectly acceptable life of service and respectability. But she would not have had this rich, full life with Carter and their children, and the ranch that had become as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. No regrets. Carter asked one evening when she shared these thoughts with him. They were alone on the porch, the children finally asleep, and the summer night was warm and full of cricket song. "Not a single one," Grace said firmly. "Turning that wagon around was the best decision I ever made." Carter reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You know, I think about that day sometimes, about what would have happened if you had not come back. I probably would have gone on with my life, running this ranch alone, never knowing what I was missing. But I would have been missing something, Grace. I would have been missing you, and that would have been the real tragedy. We found each other," Grace said simply, "and that is what matters." In 1885, they faced their biggest challenge yet. A drought hit the region, the worst anyone could remember, and it lasted through the summer and into the fall. Water became scarce, and the grass turned brown and brittle. Carter made the difficult decision to sell off half the herd before they became too weak to make the journey to market. And even with that precaution, they lost animals to the heat and lack of water. It was a stressful time, made worse by the constant worry about money and the future. Grace went back to taking in more sewing, working late into the night by lamplight to complete orders. Carter took on additional work helping neighbors with their ranches, coming home exhausted and discouraged. They snapped at each other over small things, the strain showing in ways it never had before. The breaking point came one evening when Carter came home to find Grace still hunched over her sewing, her eyes red from strain and lack of sleep. Ben and Caroline had been put to bed hours ago, but Grace was still working, determined to finish an order that was due the next day. "Grace, you need to stop," Carter said, more sharply than he intended. "You are going to ruin your eyes, and for what? A few extra dollars that will not make a difference anyway." Grace looked up, her face drawn with exhaustion and frustration. "Every dollar makes a difference, Carter. Or have you forgotten that we are barely making ends meet? Someone has to think about how we are going to feed our children through the winter." "You think I am not thinking about that?" Carter shot back. "You think I am not aware every single day that I might lose this ranch, that I might fail at providing for my family?" The words hung between them, sharp and painful, and Grace saw the fear and shame beneath Carter's anger. She set down her sewing and stood up, crossing the room to where he stood. "You are not failing," she said firmly, taking his face in her hands. "We are facing a challenge, yes, but we are facing it together. And we will get through it together, the same way we have gotten through everything else. But we cannot do that if we are attacking each other instead of supporting each other." Carter closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, and when he opened them again, there were tears there. "I am scared, Grace. I am scared that I will lose everything we have built." "I am scared too," Grace admitted. "But I believe in you, Carter. I believe in us. And I know that no matter what happens, we will find a way through." They held each other for a long time, drawing strength from the connection they had built over nearly a decade of marriage. And when they finally pulled apart, they sat down together and made a real plan that involved both of them and utilized both of their strengths. They would get through this drought, and they would do it as partners. The drought finally broke in October, and though they had lost much, they had not lost everything. The ranch survived, smaller than it had been but still viable. And more importantly, their marriage survived, strengthened by the trial they had faced together. In the years that followed, the ranch slowly rebuilt. Carter's horse breeding program began to gain a reputation, and buyers came from as far away as Kansas City to purchase his stock. Grace started a small business making quilts, using scraps of fabric to create intricate patterns that women throughout the region prized. Ben and Caroline grew into capable young people who contributed to the ranch's success, learning the value of hard work and perseverance. In 1890, Ben turned 13 and announced that he wanted to learn to be a blacksmith. Carter arranged for him to apprentice with the blacksmith in Sierra City, and though it was hard to see his son leave home, even part-time, he was proud that Ben was pursuing his own path. Caroline, at 10, showed a talent for working with the horses that rivaled her father's, and she spent hours in the barn, gentling and training the young stock. Grace and Carter watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and bittersweet awareness that they were moving toward independence. But they also found joy in having more time for just the two of them, in rediscovering the easy companionship that had first drawn them together. One evening in the fall of 1892, they rode out together to check on the herd in the north pasture. It was something they had not done in years, too busy with the demands of running the ranch and raising children. But Jack, their hired hand, had volunteered to watch Ben and Caroline for the afternoon, and Grace and Carter found themselves alone together in the vast Texas landscape. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and then Grace spoke. "Do you remember the day we met, when my wagon broke down and you said you would fix it, that I should stay?" "Of course I remember," Carter said. "It was the day my life changed, even if I did not know it yet." "I was so scared that day," Grace admitted. Not just because the wagon had broken down, but because I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I felt so lost, so unmoored. And then there you were, offering help like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You were not looking for help," Carter said with a smile. "You were trying very hard to seem like you had everything under control." "I know," Grace laughed. "But you saw through that, did you not? You saw that I was scared and alone, and you offered me a place to rest. You gave me time and space to figure out what I wanted, and what I wanted was you." Carter reached over and took her hand, their horses walking side by side. "I fell in love with you the first week you were here," he confessed. "The way you just threw yourself into helping around the ranch, the way you never complained even though I know the work was hard and unfamiliar. The way you looked at me like I was someone worth knowing. I tried to tell myself it was too soon, that I barely knew you, but my heart knew better." "We have built such a good life," Grace said softly. "It has not always been easy, but it has been good, and I would not change a single thing about it." They reached the north pasture and sat for a while on their horses, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. The herd was spread out across the grass, peaceful and content, and in the distance they could see the mountains that marked the western edge of their land. "We should probably head back," Carter said eventually. "It will be dark soon." But neither of them moved, content to savor this moment of perfect peace, of being together in the land they had built a life on. The years continued to roll by, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. Ben completed his blacksmith apprenticeship and opened his own shop in Sierra City, marrying a sweet-natured girl named Emma in 1895. Caroline discovered a love of teaching and began working at the small school in Sierra City, though she still lived at home and helped with the horses on weekends. In 1898, Grace and Carter celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary. They hosted a large gathering at the ranch, with neighbors and friends coming from miles around to mark the occasion. As Grace looked around at the full house, at the children and grandchildren and friends who had gathered to celebrate with them, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. She found Carter later that evening, standing on the porch and looking out at the stars. She slipped her hand into his and they stood together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of laughter and music from inside the house. 22 years, Carter mused. "Has it really been that long?" "It has," Grace confirmed. "And every year has been a gift." "You know what I think about sometimes," Carter said. "I think about that moment when you turned the wagon around and came back. You could have kept going. You could have built a perfectly good life in Sierra City. But you chose to come back, chose to take a chance on me, on us. That took courage, Grace. That took faith." "It was the easiest decision I ever made," Grace said. "Because even though we had only known each other for 2 weeks, I knew in my heart that you were my home, and I have never regretted that decision, not for a single moment." Carter turned to face her, pulling her close. "I love you, Grace Jenkins. I have loved you from almost the first moment I saw you standing by that broken wagon, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Grace replied, "always and forever." They kissed then, with the stars shining down on them and the sounds of their family celebrating inside. And Grace thought about how one broken wagon and one kind offer had changed the course of 2 lives, weaving them together into something beautiful and lasting. The turn of the century brought changes to the region. The frontier was slowly being tamed, with railroads connecting distant towns and new technologies making ranch life a bit easier. Carter and Grace adapted to these changes while holding on to the core values that had always guided them: honest work, mutual respect, and a commitment to their land and their family. In 1902, Caroline married a young rancher named Thomas who had been courting her for 2 years. The wedding was held at Grace and Carter's ranch, with half of Sierra City in attendance. Grace cried happy tears as she watched her daughter marry a good man who clearly adored her, and Carter beamed with pride as he walked Caroline down the makeshift aisle. Ben and Emma had given them 3 grandchildren by then, 2 boys and a girl, and Caroline and Thomas would add 2 more in the years to come. Grace loved being a grandmother, loved watching Carter teach the grandchildren to ride and rope, just as he had taught their own children. The ranch house, expanded over the years to accommodate growing family gatherings, rang with the laughter of children on holidays and Sundays. In 1905, Jack, their longtime hired hand, announced he was retiring and moving to California to live with his daughter. Carter and Grace threw him a farewell party and thanked him for nearly 25 years of loyal service. They hired 2 younger men to replace him, brothers who brought energy and new ideas to the operation. As they moved into their 60s, Carter and Grace gradually began to step back from the day-to-day running of the ranch. Ben took over much of the business management, bringing his practical skills to bear on the operation. Caroline and Thomas bought the adjacent property and began raising their own herd, creating a family ranching partnership that promised to carry on for another generation. One evening in the spring of 1910, Grace and Carter sat on the porch as they had done countless times over the past 34 years. They were older now, their hair gray and their movements slower, but the love between them burned as bright as ever. "We have had a good run," Carter said, reaching for Grace's hand. "Better than I ever dared to hope for when I was a young man working cattle drives and dreaming of having my own land." "We have had a beautiful life," Grace agreed, "full of love and hard work and children and grandchildren." "What more could anyone ask for?" "Nothing," Carter said firmly. "Absolutely nothing." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over land they had worked for more than 3 decades. Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their family. Ben and Emma had come for supper with the grandchildren, and Caroline and Thomas had stopped by after church. The house was full of noise and life and love, exactly as it should be. Grace thought back to that day in 1876, when she had arrived at this ranch with a broken wagon and a broken life, uncertain of her future and scared of what lay ahead. She thought about the moment when she had turned that wagon around, choosing love and possibility over safety and certainty. She thought about all the years since then, the challenges they had faced and overcome together, the joy they had found in building a life and a family. "I would do it all again," she said suddenly, and Carter turned to look at her. "If I could go back to that day when the wagon broke down, knowing everything I know now, I would make the same choice. I would turn that wagon around and come back to you every single time." Carter lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "And I would fix your wagon and ask you to stay every single time. Because you, Grace Jenkins, are the best thing that ever happened to me." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, they remained on the porch, 2 people who had found each other by chance and built a life by choice. Their story was not one of grand romantic gestures or dramatic proclamations. It was a story of daily kindness, of choosing each other again and again, of building something solid and lasting through years of shared work and shared love. The years that followed continued in much the same pattern. Grace and Carter grew older but remained active in the ranch and in the lives of their growing family. They celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, welcomed new grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. They weathered the small storms of life together, a bout of illness here, a difficult calving season there, always supporting each other with the strength of a partnership forged over decades. In 1915, They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary. The family gathered once again at the ranch, now 4 generations strong. Carter, at 64, still had the bearing of a cowboy despite the silver in his hair and the lines on his face. Grace, at 62, moved with a grace that age had not diminished, her eyes still the same clear gray-green that had caught Carter's attention so many years ago. During the celebration, Ben stood up to give a toast. "To my parents," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "who showed me and my sister what real love looks like. Who taught us that marriage is not just about the romance of the early days, but about choosing your partner every single day, through good times and hard times. Who built not just a ranch, but a legacy of love and hard work that will continue for generations. Thank you for everything you have given us." There was not a dry eye in the house when he finished, and Grace and Carter stood together, accepting the love and gratitude of their family. Later, when everyone had gone and they were alone again in their bedroom, Carter pulled Grace close. 40 years, he marveled. It feels like both a lifetime and no time at all. "I know what you mean," Grace said, resting her head on his shoulder. "I can still remember so clearly what it felt like to be that frightened girl with the broken wagon, and yet that feels like a different person, a different life." "You were never just a frightened girl," Carter said. "You were always brave, always strong. You just needed someone to see it and reflect it back to you." "We saved each other," Grace said simply. "You gave me a home when I needed one, and I gave you a family to fill it. We made each other whole." They drifted off to sleep that night as they had for 40 years, wrapped in each other's arms, and their dreams were peaceful and content. The final chapter of their story unfolded slowly, as the best stories often do. Carter passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1922, at the age of 71. He had spent his last day doing what he loved, working with the horses and walking the land he had spent his life building. Grace found him that evening in his favorite chair on the porch, and though her heart broke at the loss, she was grateful that he had gone peacefully, surrounded by the life he had created. She lived on for another 8 years, watching her grandchildren marry and her great-grandchildren grow. She remained sharp and engaged until the very end, still managing the household accounts and offering advice on ranch matters. She told stories about the old days to anyone who would listen, about Texas in the 1870s, about the challenges of frontier life, about the cowboy who had fixed her broken wagon and changed her life forever. Grace passed away in the spring of 1930, at the age of 77. She died in the same house where she had spent most of her adult life, in the same bed where all her children and some of her grandchildren had been born. Her last words, according to Caroline, who was with her at the end, were, "Tell your father I am coming home." They buried her next to Carter on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the vast Texas sky they had both loved so much. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the lives they had lived and the impact they had made on their community. Years later, their great-grandchildren would still work the ranch that Carter and Grace had built together. The original ranch house remained standing, preserved as a reminder of where it had all started, with a broken wagon and a cowboy's simple offer of help. The story of how they met became a family legend, told and retold at gatherings, a reminder that sometimes the most important decisions in life are made in moments of crisis, and that taking a chance on love can change everything. On the mantel in the ranch house, preserved behind glass, sits a small wooden plaque that Carter made for Grace on their 10th anniversary. It is simple and unadorned, with just a few words carved into the wood in Carter's careful hand. "She showed up with a broken wagon. I said I would fix it, she should stay. She stayed forever. Best decision we ever made." And that, in the end, was their story. Not a tale of love at first sight or grand romantic gestures, but something deeper and more enduring. A story of two people who found each other when they both needed it most, who chose each other despite the uncertainties and the risks, and who built a life together based on mutual respect, honest work, and abiding love. Their legacy lived on not just in the ranch they had built or the family they had raised, but in the example they had set. They showed that real love is not about perfection, but about partnership. That it is not about grand gestures, but about showing up every day and doing the work. That it is not about finding someone to complete you, but about finding someone to journey with through all of life's challenges and joys. The ranch continued to thrive under the care of their descendants, and every generation that worked the land remembered the story of how it all began. They remembered Grace arriving with her broken wagon and uncertain future, and Carter offering to fix it with those simple words that would change both their lives forever. "I will fix it, you stay." And she stayed, and in staying, found not just a home but a love that would echo through generations, a testament to the power of taking chances, of choosing love over fear, and of building something lasting one day at a time. As the Texas sun continues to rise and set over that land, as cattle graze on the hills and horses run in the pastures, the spirits of Grace and Carter live on in every board of the old ranch house, in every fence post that still stands, in every story told around the dinner table. They live on in the laughter of great-great-grandchildren who bear their names, in the values of hard work and integrity that still guide the family, in the understanding that sometimes the most broken things, a wagon, a heart, a life, can be mended and transformed into something beautiful. Their story is a reminder that the Wild West was not just about cowboys and cattle, not just about taming a frontier or building an empire. It was also about ordinary people making extraordinary commitments, about finding love in unexpected places, about building families and communities that would endure long after the frontier days had passed into memory. And so their story ends where it began, on a ranch in Texas, under an endless sky, with the wind whispering through the grass and the sun warming the earth. A broken wagon brought them together, but love and commitment kept them together for more than 4 decades. They lived, they loved, they built something that lasted, and that is all any of us can hope for in the end. To find someone to share the journey with, to build something meaningful together, and to leave the world a little better than we found it. Grace and Carter did all of that and more, and their story continues to inspire all who hear it. A testament to the enduring power of love, commitment, and the simple act of saying yes to possibility when it shows up, broken and dusty, on your doorstep. The sun sets one final time on their story, casting long shadows across the land they loved, and somewhere in the evening breeze, you can almost hear the echo of a wagon rolling up a dusty road, the sound of a man's voice saying he can fix what is broken, and a woman's brave decision to turn around and come home.